Hiring is arguably one of the highest leverage activities for any manager. Hire the wrong person and they can become a divider, somebody who drains energy, slows the team down, and creates problems that can last for months or years, and often leads to difficult conversations where you need to exit somebody from the business, something that nobody wants. Hire a good person and you find a solid addition to your team. But choose a truly great person and they can be a multiplier, somebody who lifts the performance of everyone around them. The challenge is that most managers are not taught how to interview well. We rely on what we've seen from others, we trust our gut instinct, and we hope that we make the right call. So for this episode, I wanted to bring in someone who has decades of experience learning how to interview well and teaching organizations how to raise their hiring bar. Sean O'Neill has spent more than 25 years leading product and technology organizations. He joined Amazon in 1999 during its hypergrowth years and spent 11 years there conducting several interviews every week. Amazon is famous for its hiring principles and its bar raiser program, a small group of people who are trusted with protecting the hiring bar across the whole organization. Sean was one of the first people to be trained as a bar raiser. Across his career, he has interviewed thousands of candidates and hired hundreds of people, and has spent many years helping other organizations raise the bar in how they hire. His approach to hiring is a combination of rigorous structure and experienced judgment, part science and part craft. And when it comes to interviewing, he has seen just about everything. For the first time on Build Your Edge, we're splitting this conversation into two parts. In the first part, we'll look at the interview itself, how to prepare, how to ask better questions, and how to uncover real evidence of a candidate's ability. In the second part, we'll look at the debrief, the structured conversation where the panel get together, compare notes, and decide whether the candidate truly raises the bar. This is part one, and we're focusing on the interview itself, both from the interviewer's perspective, but also the candidate's. In this part, Sean describes everything he learned inside Amazon, from experiential questioning through to the STAR method, and even what he calls the investigative journalist approach to interviewing. He also describes how to work out whether somebody was truly a driver, just a passenger, or maybe a faker, where the stories that they tell don't quite add up. And we also describe how a candidate can demonstrate the impact that they really had. So whether you just want to make better hires, or if you want to improve your chances of being hired by a great company, this episode and Sean's advice is for you. Let's get into the craft of interviewing. Hello, welcome back to Build Your Edge, and today I am super excited to have with me Sean O'Neill. Now, Sean's spent a long time, it's 25 years or 30 years in the technology industry as a leader. He spent 11 years at Amazon, and he's been a senior leader at Tesco's and a CPTO elsewhere. So Sean, today we're talking about the whole interviewing process. We're splitting it into two. Today, we're talking about the actual interview process, all of the prep, what happens inside the interview. And later on, we'll get on to the debrief, which is a really important topic, but that'll be in a separate part. Perhaps we can just begin by Looking briefly at your career and finding out from you where you learnt about good hiring practices.
Well, it's a great question because for so many people in their careers, they think, well, it's about doing the thing of my function. Interviewing is just this thing you do on the side when your boss says, we need more people in the loop. Can you talk to a candidate? But it turns out hiring the right person on your team is the most impactful thing a hiring manager can do all year. It really is. You know, ideas don't build businesses, people build businesses.
Yep.
So getting the right talent makes a difference. And I was very fortunate early on. I started at Amazon when Amazon was growing at an exponential rate. So even if my own team was not recruiting, every week I did 1 to 5 interviews for 11 years. New candidates coming in for all sorts of different roles. And it allowed me to really have a lot of cycles at how do I get better at my craft. And ultimately, I got trained at Amazon as a bar raiser. And that's a responsibility of a leader to not to sit in on interviews that are not your own hiring team. So you really have this facilitation approach where you're objective and you don't do desperation hires and you raise the bar. So I've done over 1,000 interviews in my career and I've learned a lot of valuable skills and I'm here to share them today.
Fantastic. And you actually teach this, don't you? You have your own masterclass and you go into companies and you teach them about hiring best practices.
I do mostly my own companies. When I came to Tesco in 2014, a company with 500,000 people, I thought surely they've got a very well established hiring process. I was shocked at how inconsistent it was. And and a lot of what we're going to talk about today, these concepts are not some radical rocket science concepts. They're just good principles consistently applied, and you get better results.
Yeah.
You're not going to get perfect hiring because even with candidates with many interview loops, you still might only have 5 to 10 hours of total time with a person trying to learn are they a fit for the role in your company before you have to make a decision. So this is not about a crystal ball to make a perfect decision, but you're going to get better, above average results from it.
Yeah. And before we get into your methods and how we get as good at hiring as we possibly can, what are the common mistakes that you see hiring managers make?
There's a whole lot of them. Sometimes one is people fall in love with the brands on the resume. Oh, look, they worked at Google. They worked
Hmm.
at Amazon. They worked at OpenAI. They must be brilliant. And in the interview, they may give them a pass on a lot of questions with a mediocre answer, like, oh yeah, but they were at Google or some other high prestige place. And the reality, the most important thing is don't fall in love with the brands on the resume. It's interesting and relevant they worked there, but that doesn't mean they were great there. So find your own evidence.
And I guess the flip is true, right? Sometimes somebody has got a bunch of companies that you've never really heard of, but that doesn't invalidate the candidate.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, there's also even another side to it where sometimes you have a candidate that worked at businesses where it was a disaster.
Hmm.
And those sometimes are the best employees because they have valuable lessons learned
Yeah.
that other people who maybe were a member of a highly successful organization, they got carried along to success, but they didn't really learn how to adapt when your first idea doesn't work.
Yeah.
So sometimes the people who have been in the train wreck companies come out with the best experience.
And before we get too much into the methods and how to be better, I want to talk about AI. So AI is everywhere. You've got job descriptions being written by AI. You've got CVs being written by AI. You've got AI reviewing the candidate against the AI driven job description. You've got candidates faking themselves in the process with AI. We're going to get specific later, but how do you spot that? How do you protect yourself as a hiring organization?
Well, it's getting harder and harder. And the fact that generative AI with voice to text and being able to have real time answers in people's ears with an earpiece while they're doing interviews really complicates trying to separate the doers from the fakers. Gartner had this report I read the other day that they predict by 2028, 1/4 of the world's candidate profiles of applicants are going to be fake, 25%.
Wow.
And in some cases, it's people faking their own resume and faking the companies they've worked at because they're trying to get a job that maybe they're unqualified for. But there's also a whole other side of malicious users who are trying to gain access to your inside company for industrial espionage or for hacking or all sorts of other reasons. So this isn't just a nice to have technique, but you really do need the ability in an interview, especially if it's remote, to be able to detect, is somebody just watching a screen and they've got granola running that's processing in the background all the questions and giving them answers. This is where the techniques I'm going to share with you today are so critical to separating the doers from the fakers.
You mentioned espionage. I mean, that sounds a little far-fetched. Is that real? Does that actually happen? And hidden
Already,
earpieces?
well, I've already talked to recruiters. This wasn't an espionage point, but I've already talked to recruiters who had candidates they were talking to who had an earpiece on in a remote call with AI pumping into their ear the response to the question just posed.
Wow.
And
Where can I get one?
well, it's already available online. You just got to piece together the right kit. But
Yeah.
the challenge is for the hiring manager, it's even more important to make sure you're making a good hiring decision. I mean, in some cases, it could be that they're not espionage workers, but maybe you have someone who wants remote work and they're going to try and get 5 jobs and just
Right.
use agentic to try and do the jobs and log into the emails and just sit back and sit on a beach somewhere. But this is a real
Nice.
problem for
Yeah.
how do what is the new Turing test that allows us to understand, is there really a person on the other side and are they qualified? And that's why
Right.
what we're going to talk about today is probably more important than it's been in the last 50 years.
Right. So we're going to take two sets of people. We're going to take the people doing the interviews, somebody who, or an organization and a group of people who are actually making a hire. We're going to focus on them a lot. But also we're going to talk about the candidate because we want the candidate to learn from this so they can be more successful
Yeah.
as well. So if we think first of all of the hiring team, getting from adequate to great at hiring takes effort. Why should they invest their time in that? What's the difference when actually you get this process right and you start to make really good hiring decisions instead of just almost impulse decisions?
Well, especially for a hiring manager who has unfilled roles in their team, hiring a great person is the gift that keeps on giving because it not only takes work off your own plate, but it actually allows you to start to delegate and give accountability to somebody who really can move your business and your function forward. So,
So do you mean they're delegating the hiring process, or because you are
no,
now
no, no.
you have had a team?
I meant you bring on somebody really talented, you may give them more responsibility than the
Got
original
it.
job spec had. So it
Yeah.
frees up time as a manager to be able to work instead of being down in the details every day, to think more strategically. What direction should we be going? How should we be reacting to the competition? All sorts of other questions that are elevated questions. When you're detailed, if you're down in the weeds every day doing the job of one of your frontline workers because you have a hole in your hiring team, you can't think strategically because you're just fighting fires all the time. So
Right.
this really is an important skill set. I think the other thing I would look at is I'm a fan of evidence. Go look back at, if you're a big enough company that you've hired at least 10 people in the last year or 20 people, go back and look at what their reviews were at mid-year review or full year review. Are they all superstars? If you really are doing your job right, every new hire should be raising the bar of your company and always trying to progress and get better.
So if anyone, I think we've all heard of bar raisers, and in fact, I've been trained as a bar raiser in a company I was at because we copied Amazon. But if anybody hasn't heard of bar raising, what does that mean?
So Bar Raiser is a program that started very early on at Amazon. So I joined Amazon in 1999, and a bar raiser is you could say it's a quality control function. It is a leader who has been trained as a bar raiser, and every single person hired at Amazon has to have a bar raiser in the loop who is not in the hiring team. And that brings a sense of objectivity. So, and by the way, I haven't been at Amazon in 10 or 11 years. So they may well have changed it, but this is when I had exited. And less than, I think, 0.5% of all employees at Amazon were trained as bar raisers. So it was quite an honor to be trained and selected. But your job was to help the hiring manager facilitate a good hiring loop with the right criteria, but also facilitate the debrief and get to a high quality decision. Because sometimes you'll have a candidate who maybe is so amazing, maybe they're actually over leveled and they misread the job descriptions, which happens. And maybe they really should be a director level, not a senior manager level. Or you'll have somebody where everybody was downgraded on them, not inclined to hire, but everyone loved this person. Well, maybe they're actually not at the senior level, but should be at the product manager one level, and they could be a star there. So there's really a work on not just getting to a better hiring decision, but training everyone else in the interview loop to raise their game and get better at their craft as well.
So as a product and technology leader, you may well have found yourself in even a sales interview.
Oh, yeah.
So, but you don't know anything. Well, forgive me, you may, but let's assume you know nothing about sales. How do you bring a level of expertise to that to say, I recognize this person could be a good salesperson?
So this is where the criteria that gets assigned to each interviewer is important. So there's a number of criteria you may care about. We care about the functional expertise of the role. We may care about domain expertise in the space, but we also care about delivers results, communication. We care about customer obsession, data driven, all sorts of other criteria that might matter. So the hiring manager, when they assign the criteria, if the bar raiser is not a specialist in that function, then you assign them criteria that are more universal, like their
Right.
ability to communicate, their ability to collaborate. And the examples that come out of these questions, it doesn't matter if you understand how the sales function works, you're really trying to probe for, tell me about a time when you had a serious disagreement with a coworker on an important topic for a project. What'd you do? This is about people at that point. And
Right.
so a bar raiser is qualified to do that.
Right. And when a company gets their act together and they do have a good process and there is a bar raiser and everything is much more impartial, I guess, what does that feel like for the candidate? Why is it important, not just for the company to get this right, but also for the candidates who are coming into the process?
So I think it's important for the candidate because the better everyone is at the craft on the interview loop, the smoother it should be for the candidate. And you won't have any of these problems like, oh, as an interviewer, I didn't manage the time well and I ran out of time. And sorry, you didn't get to ask questions at the end, candidate. Or I didn't get to actually ask all the key issues I wanted because as an interviewer, I let the questions run too long. You get a much smoother flow as a process. And then as a candidate, frankly, the questions might be harder for you, but they also will help recognize this is a company that knows their stuff.
Yeah. And we are going to get into some techniques that the candidate can use to make sure they turn up and perform well in
That's
the
right.
interview. So if you're a candidate and you're listening to this, like stay with us, listen to the content, and then we're going to reflect at the end. So let's get into your methods now. Let's get into your masterclass, Sean. You've left behind for us, like every guest does, something that the audience can download. Now, you've left behind a spreadsheet, which is a
Mm-hmm.
template, and it's in two parts, which naturally fits in with the two parts of this masterclass. The second part we'll get to, which is how you manage a debrief and how you score and how you make a decision. But the first part is very much about setting up the interview process itself, and what an interviewer does with a candidate during their part of the interview. Could you just describe for us at a really high level what the tool is, why it's important, and how you use it?
Sure. So when you and I were chatting about what sort of download or giveaway could I give for this, immediately I thought of the Excel tracker tool that I have been using for years and just iterating and tweaking. So this is, there's a number of tabs on it. By the way, I'm an Excel nerd. I love Excel because it's so functional and flexible to do all sorts of stuff. So I've got a lot of color coding in here and scoring that allows the interviewer to think about what are all the criteria that are relevant for that role and what criteria were they assigned and how do they go through after an interview with a structure to allow them to kind of detangle all of their thoughts of, oh, I love this candidate, but I don't think they did as well in this. This criteria scoring allows you to separate what are the things you really admired about a candidate and what are your concerns, and then be able to come up with a vote. And then ultimately, there's some other tabs that we'll bring back when we talk in part 2 about the debrief, about how the hiring manager or facilitator compiles all the blind vote scorings from each person, reveals in the debrief the overall score. And then there's another tab in there as well of the high quality problem. If you have more than one candidate you're inclined to hire, how do you then compare against those candidates? So got 3 different key tabs in here. Today, we're going to mostly talk about the interviewer tab that allows them, especially for more than one candidate, to be able to capture what is their sentiment about the qualities of this candidate.
Yeah, and I would add, as somebody who's also done loads of interviews, if you do not take some form of notes during the interview, I found myself, you leave the interview with a kind of a feeling, you go, oh, that was quite good or whatever. But if you then go through your notes, you'll realize the things that you tracked, and your high level feeling you're left with at the end can very often change based on fact. And it makes it much more factual rather than emotional. So the tool is brilliant for that. So we've got a team of people. They're going to hire, they're going to interview a bunch of people for an open role. Talk about the prep that needs to go in before anybody does any interviews.
So the hiring manager has a lot of work to do first. And too often, hiring managers can be a little bit lazy on this. Job description is so fundamental, having a good, clear job description of what is it you really want to do. And so many times I look at a job profile and it's just a list of 50 bullet points. They may have broken it up into like, oh, this is your responsibility and these are the skills you need and a good candidate. But ultimately, they're saying 50 different things. And it confuses the candidates of, am I qualified for this role? And frankly, it confuses the other interviewers if they ever even saw the job description, which sometimes people will say, can you interview this candidate? You don't even know what role, what's the job description? What are we expecting? So the hiring manager has a critical role to shape the entire flow. And
on the job description, what should they be trying to convey in that document?
So first off, you'd want to understand what is the job family or profile, because you got to think of a job description as an advertisement. You're targeting a certain type of candidate at a certain quality and capability level that might be a title level. And we all know that there's a real inconsistency about how different companies use job titles. So it's common that a candidate applies for a job that is at a level either higher or lower than what they really were expecting. So those happen all the time. A good job description minimizes that kind of confusion and false positive, false negative applications. So you really want to think about this job, but one of the more important questions the hiring manager has to ask, if somebody's incredibly successful and impactful in this role, after 12 months, what would the outcomes look like? And then those 3 things should be in your top description. This key role is, restart our strategic roadmap and deliver our major transformation and unlock the ability for us to start selling our product into this new sector. Don't have 50 different things they're doing at the top. Really call it out. And in fact, frankly, it's an advertisement for good talent. So you want to call out the hero message of why would somebody want this job? And you need to be really concise in that. Yeah. The other thing that's very helpful from this is, what are the criteria that are relevant for this particular job? So different companies, they all have their own culture. They all have different principles or criteria that they feel are important. As I really was trained up on the Amazon world, a lot of those still are very valid and resonate for me. Things like your ability to think big, your strategic thinking. If you're interviewing for, say, a product management role, it might be the product skill set. What's your collaboration skills? Are you customer obsessed, data driven? They may vary by company, but they also will vary by job. So if I'm looking for someone who is a back-end engineer, I'd like them to be customer obsessed, but that might not be as important as their technical or functional capabilities, their curiosity, and their judgment. I mean, overall, of all these criteria, some of the ones that I'm always looking at is your bias for action, in your judgment, and your ability to work with others well. And ultimately, those wrap up into, do you get the right stuff done?
Yep.
And the right stuff is really about good judgment and anticipating not just the short term tactical goal, but does this help our business and our customers move forward?
Yeah, I
So,
mean, I've said it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, no,
I've learned throughout my career that there are three things: there's knowledge, there's skill, and activity. Knowledge and skill you can kind of understand, but activity, part of that is execution. So you may know a load of stuff, you might be really good at it, but do you actually do it in the first place, and do you do the right things?
yes, exactly. So this hiring manager, you need to think about what are those criteria and name them in your job description.
Yeah.
And these criteria are very, very important. They're the backbone of the interview process because let's say you've got 6, 7 different criteria. You have 4 people, including yourself as hiring manager, who are going to be in the interview loop. Your job is to then assign those criteria to each of the interviewers. So usually you've got 1 or 2 criteria for each of the interviewers. Now, as an interviewer, part of your prep is to really understand, okay, what is this role we're hiring for? Is there anything particular specific about it? Like, well, it's a transformation role and we've got a lot of legacy systems. So you've got to really test. Great, you've done well when you've got a blank page of code you've written, but can you go and work with a system written in COBOL? You need to
Yeah.
understand what's the nature of the job. And then as a interviewer, your job is to be able to come back with a confident vote and score of how well is this candidate on Think Big or collaboration or delivers results. You can ask any other questions you want, and everyone has their own personal questions they like to calibrate on. I have many of them myself, but your job is to make sure you've got a strong point of view at the end on those criteria. So you sequence your questions you're going to ask ahead of time so you get through those first. The other
And that's
thing,
an important point, isn't it? Because multi-stage interviews are not at all uncommon now, but it isn't just a chat with 6 different people. It's this person is going to dive into this particular thing so they can give an opinion on my ability to deliver on one particular thing. The
yes,
next set of people will have a different topic. And as you say, there may be some commonality, but you're diving into me from 6 different directions and coming together to see what do I look like as a whole.
exactly. And that 6 different directions is a great metaphor. I'd like to think of the Trivial Pursuit board.
Yeah.
Each of those categories, there's a different expertise in Trivial Pursuit. The reason you assign these criteria out is that if everyone asks the same question of how would you use Gen AI in a
Mm-hmm.
differentiated product, you're going to have a great view deep on how they do in that topic, but maybe nobody asked about are they a good manager? Nobody asked about how they've fixed broken projects, and you end up having a lot of gaps. So by assigning them, each interviewer is like one of those pieces of the Trivial Pursuit puzzle. And each person has a particular wedge where they understand a deep view and maybe a kind of a thin view of some of these other questions they may have asked. And you've got to form a decision and vote. And when the debrief comes together, you reveal all the pieces and everyone's position, and you actually have a much richer conversation. So you really need to make sure that you understand your criteria and you have an idea of what kind of questions should I ask that would reveal to me this person, their qualifications on that category. I think the last bit is make sure you read the resume.
Mm-hmm.
Go look them up on LinkedIn. If you've got time, go see if they posted anything. Do they have any YouTube videos that they're in? Learn a little bit about them. I, over my career, have been deeply embarrassed as a candidate when I'm on the other side of an interview with someone and it's clear they didn't even glance at my resume, which was a single page. Like
Yeah.
they didn't even know anything about me. And it you've got to remember you're buying and selling at the same time in an interview cycle. The candidate's forming an opinion too. And that sort of disregard for my time to not even spend the time to know about me so that we end up churning the first 10 minutes of our scarce time slot together for me to tell you what you could have read in 30 seconds is frankly insulting. So
Yeah.
do your homework.
As a candidate, when you rock up into an interview and the interviewer says, "Oh, I see you did this. Tell me more about that." That's much more engaging, and I feel much more welcome. And valued than just like, oh, tell me about yourself. It's like, well, do some work.
Yes. Well, the other benefit of actually looking over it, and we'll come to this later in a sec, is you get to see what they've claimed.
Yes.
You get to see what they've claimed that they did and how much they've achieved it. And that will come into play as we talk about some of the questions.
Yeah. All right. So we've got the job description really well written. We've got the hiring manager on the hook now, so they know who they're hiring, and they have allocated parts of it out to a number of people. Let's call it 6. It's not uncommon these days. So 6 people, and now you've got 6 stages. Each person's going to deep dive on one particular thing. And now you've got some CVs that have started to come through. And I think we've already covered you owe it to the candidate to look through the CV, do a bit of background research, and be prepared. And I'd love to explore that concept of being prepared, because it's a really bad candidate experience when the hiring manager or the person doing the interview rocks up late, or is clearly unprepared, or it just knows nothing about what they're about to do. How does a hire or an interviewer, how do they prepare properly for that 9:30 in the morning meeting with a candidate?
So everyone's got their own technique, but you must take notes. Notes are really, really valuable because you want a good conversation with a candidate, but you also want good recall later. And I think one other element for both the interviewers and the hiring manager is good candidates are in high demand, and
Yep.
do not be slow and delayed on scheduling and having these interviews. You really need to be on the ball, because think of it like a sales lead. If your company was pitching a sales contract with a client, and you're like, yeah, the client's interested in signing, but they need to talk to us. Yeah, can I get to them in 3 weeks?
Yeah.
Sends a terrible message. And by the way, people post online, like Glassdoor and others. I interviewed for this job. The interviewer showed up 15 minutes late. No apologies. This is the rudest company on the planet. That's the
Yep.
brand you're shaping. So it matters to actually show some respect for the candidate, but also go fast. Like, you need to schedule, all these interviews should be scheduled same day, within days, and the debrief should take place 24 hours after the last interview.
Yeah, I agree. I always used to try and get from hello to offer in 2 weeks, and it's totally
Yeah.
doable, even if you've got a number of steps. If you're properly organized, if you give it the right set of value, you can get from hello, Sean, to Sean, we'd like to offer you a job within 2 weeks.
But I say this is also whoever your leader of your organization is. They set the tone for how people should manage their time. And if
Yeah.
the leader of the whole organization doesn't care about recruiting, you're going to see it trickle down to, well, I just don't have time to do these interviews. If the
Yeah.
leader of the organization knows getting the right talent into these roles is the difference between first and last, and they tell people this is a priority, you should be spending this much of your time every week on interviews, that sets the tone. In fact, as a leader, I often would say, well, let's see what our pipeline of interviews looks like. Why is it going so slow? So that really helps set a tone from a leader of a whole organization.
Yeah. And I would also add, we're all busy, and I've been in plenty of roles where my diary is just jam packed from from morning till evening. But if I know I have an interview, I'll make sure that I have 15 minutes free before that, because I need to get out of the meeting I'm in. Maybe I need to walk to a booth or an office or something. I need to sit down. I need to make sure my stuff is ready, and I need to have 5 minutes before the candidate joins, so I'm ready. And I think it shows up. And you can tell when a hiring manager just literally rushed in and they go, well, let me just get myself sorted out. It just starts off so badly.
Yeah. So this is where the prep also on LinkedIn can help, because with LinkedIn, you can look over what is the candidate claiming they've done. And I've seen examples of candidates that were at companies, they were in my organization, and I know they were an individual contributor, but they claimed they were a vice president. So there's all sorts of fabrication that can happen out there, title inflation,
Yep.
titles. But you also want to see, what are people claiming? And so when I'm scanning through, I look for, do we have any direct connections that I happen to know? Because that also could be interesting during the interview of like, oh, well, I happen to know Sally really well. What would she tell me about how you did in this job? And
Oh, crikey. I actually don't know Sally at all. Yeah, I
exactly
bluffed.
that sort of thing comes out. But not always to the negative. Sometimes it's to the positive as well. But you're also trying to say, what are their biggest accomplishments as you scan through, especially from your criteria? Because I'm trying to take notes. I use a Word doc, and over the years, I've become very good at typing. So I actually am pretty fast at typing. I could be a court stenographer, perhaps,
Yep. Yep.
if I chose to. But it allows me to capture a lot of details. So I will capture ahead of time any particular questions I think I may want to ask. And frankly, as an interviewer, and I've done over 1,000, I always also look for the personality. I love to see on a
Yep.
candidate's resume other interests.
Yep.
If and you'd be surprised at the kind of connection you can create with an interviewer because the candidate talks about, I love traveling the world to historical places. Well, I love traveling the world to historical places. Suddenly we have an open that actually can create a connection between people. So
Yeah.
never shy away from doing that.
And on the notes issue, I also take a lot of notes. I'm not as good as typist as you, but I'm pretty fast. But I don't care about spelling and punctuation and grammar. I literally just drop my thoughts down. I can come back in later on. And there's sometimes just a thing that you type and you go, oh, I forgot about that. But yes, look at that thing. And it changes your impression completely.
Yes. Yes.
Let's talk about the kind of questions that you ask. So again, I want to set it up. We've got the job description. We've got interviewers lined up to talk about a particular topic. Should each interviewer have their own set of questions lined up in advance? I mean, I use a Notion doc, and I'll just duplicate that page for this candidate based on this interview loop that I'm in. And now I know I've got my standard set of questions and I can go through it in the. So how should an interviewing manager formulate what those questions are for this part of the interview loop?
So different managers or interviewers can do it in different ways. I too like a Word doc, and I have a template, and I just make a copy for every single candidate.
Yep.
And I've got a question bank in there of questions that I've come to like over time, but I've got a lot of them that I built up. And I've been doing this for 25 years, so I've got quite a long list of interesting questions. Some in heavy rotation, some depending on the topic, I may go pull out. If I'm interviewing a data analyst, I will go pull out one of my old SQL questions and
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
just to test to make sure. Tell me the difference between an inner join and an outer join, just to make sure that I'm testing for comprehension. But so you want a list of questions, and then before my interview, I'll tend to pull some of them up that I think I'm going to be asking that are relevant to my topics, to
Yep.
my criteria, whatever I'm assigned.
Yeah, and I find that, yeah, again, if you've got, I don't know how many you have, but let's just say it's 200 questions you could pull from. You clearly don't want to ask 200 questions. You might want to ask, it could even be just 5 or 6 really good quality questions.
That's right.
But I pull them together and go, right, for this particular interview loop in my engagement on this, I'm going to interview 10 candidates. I have the same starting deck of 6 questions and I can start from there, and it produces some consistency, but also I can freeform a bit. I can navigate and, go with the candidate.
And you bring up an excellent point here. If you're interviewing multiple candidates in a loop, comparison is really valuable and really useful.
Yes.
So I do ask the same questions of all these candidates for the same interview loop on a job, because then that gives me some sort of baseline against each of them. And the one other point I wanted to call out also is the time management here. It depends how long your interview is. I will say I severely dislike 30-minute interview slots. I
Yep.
find them way too insufficient to really evaluate and make a good hiring decision for a candidate in the moment. I prefer an hour. I could do 45 minutes if that's all that really will fit. But I think a 30-minute question has problems because
I agree.
generally in the format, there's 3 sections to any interview. There's an introduction. Hi, how you doing? Great, good to chat with you today. Then there's the core interviewer questions you got to get through. And in an hour interview, I tend to do 5 minutes intro, 40 minutes to 45 minutes of interviewer question, and then 10 to 15 minutes at the end for the candidate to ask questions back from me. And it's very important for both the interviewer and the candidate to watch the clock and manage the time. So in my 40 to 45 minutes of questions, I probably only ask 4 big questions. with
Yeah.
lots of follow-ons, and we'll get into some of that. But I'm not asking 20 rapid-fire questions. I'm
Yeah.
probably asking, 4 to 6 relatively meaty questions and getting into 5 minutes to 8 minutes each.
Yeah.
But if you as an interviewer are letting someone drone on for 20 minutes on an answer, you are responsible for burning the clock. And you may
Yes.
not even get, if let's say you have 2 criteria you have to get to, or maybe even 3, you may fail to come up with a good answer of what's your view on this candidate on these criteria. And that's your primary responsibility to bring into the debrief.
I've been there. I've been there. I failed in an interview as an interviewer because the candidate spoke too much and I didn't control it enough. And your overwhelming feeling is, I had 2 things to find out. I've got a good view on this. I didn't get time for number 2. And it's like, what's the point? You've failed as an interviewer.
Yeah. Well, and this is why repeated cycles help you get better.
Yeah.
These are just good techniques consistently applied. So I
Yeah.
find a couple tools that I use when I'm in an interview with somebody. I will ask a question like, give me an example of when you had a stalled project that you needed to get on track, and what did you do? And sometimes, often, people will say, well, I've got 2 examples, and let me give them to you, and I'll pause them.
Mm-hmm.
I'll, interest of time, pick the best one. Pick the
Yep.
best one for impact to the business. So I'm helping them. I'm steering and filtering, saying, don't pick an inconsequential example. Pick the most important one. And frankly, I'll see from their judgment what they think important counts as. But then it allows them to save time. Now, the other bit is I'm watching the clock as they're going through an answer. And as an interviewer, you have to decide, like, let's say you really care about think big and strategy. And as they're going through, you might say, I really want to understand how you thought about this from a strategic perspective. Sometimes people will really get into the details of a story. And you can see, wow, they spent 3 or 4 minutes already talking about the pre-setup for this project. Why don't we pull it up a level? Do not feel it's rude to intervene. You're doing them a favor to say, hey, in the interest of time, let's pull it up a level and let's talk more about how the priorities were set and your role involved in that. And that
Yeah.
helps manage for time. And then, there's times where I'm interviewing candidates where I may give them a nudge to help steer them back. And then sometimes I might give them a second nudge of like, no, you're still in the weeds. Let's see if we can get here. And then after a period of time, I've drawn a conclusion. They just don't know the skill. They don't have, say, the strategy or whatever it is. I've got to cut the cord on that. So I'll say, that's fantastic. I think that's sufficient. Why don't we move on?
Yeah.
But this is also very important for the interviewer. You are selling as well as buying here. So even if a candidate is not giving you an answer that you feel is a good answer, do your best to not let it show, because it's a problem if you make the interviewer anxious and you put them off their best game. You don't want to give them this facial reaction of like, oh my God, that is the worst answer ever. You don't want them to read your body language like they're doing terrible, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy for them and you're
Yeah.
not getting the best responses for your next question. So
Yeah.
you really, as an interviewer, need to put the candidate at ease and help guide them through it. And it's okay to say, hey, that's great. In the interest of time, why don't we wrap it there? I've got what I needed on that. There's some other important questions I want to ask.
Yeah.
Always in a positive manner.
Talking of time, my little top tip here is a lot of interviews now are online. You're looking at the camera, and it's really hard to look at a clock, and you take your eyes off it, just looks poor. I downloaded a simple, it's like a £5 or something, a little digital clock that just floats on the screen. I put it on my screen just under the lens, and I can constantly keep an eye, and then I'm constantly in tune with where we're going, and I don't have to feel like I'm rushing the candidate on. Can we talk about questions now?
Yes.
What makes a good interview question? So we've worked out that there will be different categories, but now I'm going to prepare a single question to dive into a single topic. You talk about experiential questions. What does that mean?
So this is something valuable lessons I learned at Amazon. And Amazon, when I joined Amazon originally, there were something like 2,000 people worldwide at Amazon, relatively small.
Yeah,
And
it's going to fail, that business, right?
it was just growing so rapidly. And Amazon has always been a very scientific place, a very rigorous place of let's not just go on our gut. What does the evidence and the data show us? And so Amazon approached recruiting as a science early on and did lots of controlled experiments. There would be, and this is going back to 2000, 2001, 2002, where a developer might interview with the company, and one group of developers goes through only in-person interviews. Another group of developers might only take an online challenge to code. And this was pre-AI and frankly pre-Substack and a lot of other tools that might have helped you. But can you solve some online challenge and be hired only based on how they performed functionally? And another group might have a mix of those things. And then Amazon would just track. We were hiring enough developers that we just hire them as a treatment or challenge to the control, and then see how did they do and which method worked better. And so early on, Amazon learned some very important lessons. One, smart developers who are interviewing like to ask brain teasers. Brain teasers are terrible interview questions that do not correlate with doing well in a job afterwards. These
Right.
brain teasers where there's only one right answer or wrong answer, like there's 3 light bulbs in a room and 3 light switches outside, and how can you figure out the right configuration by only entering the room once? Like that makes the interviewer feel smart,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
doesn't actually correlate with a good employee. So early on, Amazon started to realize, okay, let's stop asking those. The other interesting point is you sometimes get into an interview with someone, hey, I've been in this role for 5 years. Let me give you the hardest problem I haven't solved in 5 years, and let's see if in 5 minutes you can give me an answer I hadn't thought of. Go. And those are terrible
Crazy.
questions. Those,
Crazy.
those internal expert questions are absolutely terrible because 95% of the time you're going to get an answer that wasn't good. But what you cannot tell is, was their answer not good because they don't know the inner workings and the inner systems of our company? Or was their answer not good because they're not qualified to functionally do that skill set? You cannot tell them apart. There are some other questions that we learned over time that aren't great. So in one case, avoid asking closed questions. One word answer of, do you keep your teams motivated? Yes.
Yeah. No, I don't. No.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Who's going to say no? Avoid, asking leading questions of how important is customer obsession to you? If
Yeah.
that's one of our core principles as a business, right? This is also a very important one. I never ask theoretical, hypothetical questions. How would you bring a new product to market using Gen AI? Because people can be very good at the theory. There's lots of books out there. There's lots of examples, and no matter what their functional role is, people can be very good at giving a theoretical, solid answer. It doesn't mean they've ever done it.
Yeah.
So what over time at Amazon, we really settled on experiential questions. And this is important also for the whole point of how do you separate the doers from the drivers from passengers from fakers. How much context do they really have? And give me an example of a time when you really did it. And these types of questions make a huge difference. So let me give you an example of one. So rather than ask, hey, if you had to steer a company in a new direction, what would you do? Oh, well, I would write a vision statement and I would set the right OKRs and we do blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I ask an experiential question. So this is one from my book. So I'm going to read it here. Give me an example of a time when you had to fight to convince a manager, a client, or a team to change their mind on an important issue or decision. So this is an experiential question. And there are conflicts all over every company all the time. And this allows me to, the criteria that this would reveal is, does somebody have backbone and can they actually stand up versus just going along with the flow, even if they think it's wrong. But it also can show in their answer collaboration of how do they challenge others. It could also show examples of data-driven Are they bringing evidence? Are they bringing gut? So this type of question allows me to say, first off, what do they define as important? Maybe it was, they switched the coffee in the coffee maker, and I was not going to have that. Okay, now I've got a sense of what you feel is critically important. Or they're going to say, look, they wanted to pivot the strategy and go all in on blockchain when we are a beverage company or something like that,
Yeah.
right? So help me understand what they feel. And then this opens up a whole series of follow-on questions that allows me to say, okay, set up the situation. What was your role in this? What was the problem? And then how did you approach it? And you can have a number of follow-on questions that go with this.
So we're going to get into the STAR technique in a minute, which I want to move on to. But before I do, if you ask me that question, and I do not have an experience that I can relate to, and I've never actually had to do that, what's the right approach? What's the right response from me?
As a candidate?
Yeah, as a candidate, yeah.
Well, so there are some questions that might be very experiential. Like, give me an example of a time when you turned around a failing project. Well, depending on your career, you might have been lucky enough to never be in a failing project. That can happen. So, and if you say that, then okay, play that back to me as the interviewer, and I'll see whether I want to pick a different question, or maybe I'll reword of, okay, tell me a time when you wanted to change direction on an important project. Because ultimately, if I'm asking this type of question, I probably have the criteria around collaboration, and maybe bias for action of, are you being passive or are you a driver? And I'm trying to distinguish that. So, it's okay if you say, well, I haven't done that particular experience, but I do have this, which is kind of close to it. Would that be sufficient? And in fact, for both the candidate and the interviewer, it's okay to ask for clarification of, is this appropriate versus just jumping in?
Yeah. So as a candidate, then I should, if I can't relate to the experience, I shouldn't just go, no, I've never done that, mate. I should try and think about what is it you're trying to get to, and then come up with something close and say, look, I haven't done what you specifically talked about, but I've done this. Could we talk about that? And then that would give you the grounds as an interviewer to dive deep. Okay. Let's talk about the STAR technique. It's a well-established thing, and I'm not sure if Amazon introduced it or not, but it's a well-established process for interviewers, and we will come later on to candidates as well. It's really important candidates understand this. Could we briefly walk through what the STAR technique is?
Sure. So STAR is an acronym for situation, task, action, result. And it's a very nice, simple framework that when you get a question, like, give me an example of a time when you had to fight to convince a manager or team to change their mind on an important issue or decision. You could say, okay, here's the situation. We had a big project. The original scope of it was to go into blockchain. At this time, nobody else in the team close to clients or to technology felt this was the right decision. And we wanted to pivot because we've been working on it for a while. Okay. The task was, how do we actually decide what we're going to work on? The action was, here's how I pulled together the evidence of the market research and the competitive landscape and why we should go in this direction, not this direction, and the result. Did you succeed or not? And this is important for the interviewer. Sometimes the best answers are when they did not succeed, however, drew lessons learned of what they would do differently next time. So this is important. This is not all about everything you ever did was success.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most valuable lessons learned are when you got something wrong and you learned from it. And, I like to think of those as tuition. What did it cost you in tuition to get that lesson?
That almost makes it a START process then, really. Situation, task, actions, results, and tuition. I love that. We've just invented something new. I like it. And now you've touched on the concept of driver, passenger, and faker a few times.
Yes.
And again, if you're a candidate listening, listen to this closely, but also as an interviewer, this is really important. What do we mean by driver, passenger, and faker?
So in any initiative, you could have 20, 30 people working on a project. You're probably going to have 5% or 10% of the people in that who are the primary drivers of change makers, or whatever it is. You then may have another 30 to 50% who are solid delivery. They are doing good work, maybe under the lead or tutelage of others, but they're doing good work. But then you're going to have maybe the bottom 10 to 20% or 30%. They might just be passengers. They might have been in that team, but they had no bearing on the success or failure of it. They were just carried along. So those are the drivers. Then you've got those passengers who they were there. They may have claimed they did it all, but did they really? And you want to figure that out. And then there's the fakers who were never even there, but are claiming it. And there's this interesting example that I had in my career. I worked in ad tech for Amazon at one point on this product called Product Ads. And this was 2010 to 2014, roughly. I was working on product ads. And there is this fascinating time where I was interviewing lots of people who were also in the ad tech industry. And about 5 years earlier, Yahoo had launched this really well-known new platform called Panama. Really fundamental for Yahoo, saved the business, really, because they were struggling so much with their ad monetization and losing out to Google. And then Facebook was just coming on as well. So Panama was a big deal. I must have interviewed at least 20 or 30 people who all claimed personally to have built Panama.
Right.
That cannot be true. That just cannot be true. And so this is also where these experiential questions really come into play. And it helps also against the Gen AI trying to give somebody an answer on a screen, because on many times, Gen AI may not have that real plausible contextual depth of what happened inside a company that was not open to the public of what happened in the dynamics. And so this is where I get to this concept of the investigative journalist.
Yeah. Before you dive into that though, Sean, you may ask me about something, and I genuinely was a passenger. I was there, I contributed to it, but I wasn't really a driver. Somebody else did that. Is that okay for me to say that?
I would think of it this way. There's only a few people who are going to make a priorities decision. And if there's 50 people in the team, it probably wasn't communal. So that's not going to be a surprise. So sometimes I will ask, like, someone will say, I launched this new proposition for
Right.
the business. Oh, okay, great. Whose idea was it? And I'm not holding against them if they say, it came from the sales lead who talks to a lot of customers. Like, I don't fault them for it, but they don't get credit for the innovation of the concept. But again, most good businesses aren't the first idea. It's how did you adapt and learn along the way? So then I may actually check, okay, well, what did you learn along the way? And what was your value add? And what was your contribution? I'm ultimately trying to get to what was your value add. And if you were a entry level designer, I'm not going to expect that, I redid the entire library and everyone loved it and it saved the day. But if you were a senior director,
Mm-hmm.
and it turns out through my questions you're really just a passenger, well, that doesn't reflect well on you because that was your
Right.
job.
Right. And that, I guess you're almost there trying to get into the fakers, aren't you? The people who are claiming something, but they're exaggerating. Do you also find sometimes, because people can play down their accomplishments too, can't they? They're just not that kind of person. And sometimes you can dive in and say, well, hang on, that was interesting. Tell me more about that.
That absolutely happens. And it's funny because there's a couple of things I do listen to. I always like to hear, do they say we or more than I, or I
Yeah.
more than we, is one of those things. However, in an interview, it's all right to say, normally as a candidate, normally I'd always say we, but for this conversation, I'm going to use the word I because I want you to know what I did versus what the
Yeah.
team.
Yeah.
And that can be a good clarification as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about investigative journalism and probing questions, because that's one thing that you talked about a lot when we were preparing for this. And that, as I understand it, it's you ask me a question and I claim to be a driver on this thing. But what I'm understanding is you then don't take that at face value. You become an investigative journalist. What does that look like in an interview?
That's right. So as I've been training people for over 10 years outside of Amazon on this at Tesco and my business is GFK and Synchron. I've come up with this framework, the mental model of imagine you're an investigative journalist and your editor gives you a task. Go talk to this candidate. She claims she's qualified to work for this company in this role with this experience. Go get the story. And if you were, a writer for The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, and you go and talk to a candidate and you ask her, are you qualified to do this role? And she says, yes. You go, oh, there's my story. And you go back to your editor and you give them your story. She says, yes. They would throw you out of the room.
Right.
Where's the evidence, right? Where's your fact checking? Dig. Go back and get the real story. You're not done with this article. So you then go back and then you start asking the candidate not hypothetical questions, but experiential questions. Tell me about a time when you, this, depending on the role, maybe it's tell me about a time where, if you're an analyst, you significantly improve the ability of a company to understand and course correct from the performance. Ultimately, I'm trying to get to dashboards or KPIs or something, and how did you help someone not just get the numbers, but draw the right conclusions from it? Was it operational? And so somebody says, oh, yes, I worked on this. Okay, well, great. Tell me more about it. And I'm going to dig. And or let's use the Panama example for Yahoo's ad server. Okay, great. You were on there. What was your role?
Mm-hmm.
Where did the idea come from? When did you enter the situation? Okay, wow. Trying to take a significant chunk of resources away from the other existing running businesses. Did that create any tensions?
Mm-hmm.
Whose objections did you have to overcome? What was the most significant problem you had to solve here? And how did you solve it? And then how did you roll this out across all of these business units and countries? And at some point of time, people can only go so deep if they were a passenger. And
then
only
they get a break.
Yeah, or they're just starting to make up stuff. And you're
Yep.
not going to be able to tell if they're completely lying.
Yep.
But you can start to hear when somebody starts losing the granularity of context if they were really in it. If they really said, oh, what the fundamental problem was this 40 millisecond SLA that we have for the ad server to be able to return it. And the only way we solved it was solving it through this amazing innovation that my partner did to really rethink about how we stored this data and how we cached it. Once they get down to a certain level, you start to have more confidence that they were really there. And then you get through what was the real impact on it. So this investigative journalist mental model is really, really useful because you're looking for evidence, but you also know in the back of your mind what criteria matters most. So you're shaping the questions towards whatever the criteria is you're talking about. Is it about collaboration? Is it about bias for action? Is it about strategy and think big? Is it about delivers impact? So you're guiding your drill down questions towards your topics to be able to give you the credibility to say they successfully answered that or they, did not meet they waffled.
And as I'm listening to you, I hear quite a strong thread of the Amazon leadership principles, which if anyone hasn't looked at them, I was pointed at them some time ago and I thought, what can they be? But you actually read them and it is, you don't actually know how to change it. They're phenomenal, aren't they? They cover everything, every facet of somebody who is a good, not just a leader, but even an engineer or whatever.
That's right.
They need to display a part of all of those, don't they?
They absolutely do. And for different roles, some may have greater importance than others. Yeah. Now, the other really valuable thing, and when we get into the debrief side in part 2, we can touch on this. Part of the facilitator's role here is helping the interviewers, some of whom might be new to interviewing, and maybe they're even new to being a manager, and they're interviewing. They are connected because across Amazon with these principles, as I was talking to lots and lots of candidates about these principles and criteria and evaluating the candidates, it made me better as a manager to understand how to develop my own team. So they really are all connected in your company.
So now we understand all of the questions and we understand what we're driving into. you're taking notes as you're going through the interview, and at some point you're going to bring the interview to a close. We'll talk about how you close an interview down in a second, but I want to go to the end. So you've completed your hour, the call is finished, and I have my approach, but I'd love to hear from you. What is it that you do in that first 5 or 10 or 15 minutes after the interview as an interviewer? What are you trying to do in that immediate period?
So once the interview's done, so you've had your interview, you've had your questions, you've had the candidate time to ask questions of you and given them good, honest reflections back. You now have to come to a decision. And so this is where the downloadable tool, my Excel interview tool, can help you out here, because you should have populated across. So in the tool, it's color coded and got all these criteria across the top, which you should replace with whatever criteria is relevant for your company across the interview loop, beyond just your own assigned ones, all the ones relevant for this candidate.
Yep.
And then you go through and you score them 1 to 5. So what I usually do is I've got notes, and usually there's a block of notes against each of the questions. And then I'll try and draw a conclusion. So if one of my questions was about collaboration and, trying to have backbone and convince people that we should try something differently, I'll basically write a summary. So on backbone and collaboration, do I put it as a plus or a minus? So it's very simple. Do I think they did a good job answering this question and giving me evidence that I think they have this skill or this capability, or did they fail to convince me they have the skill? And I'll put usually a minus backbone or a plus backbone, and then I'll write maybe a 1-sentence summary of, plus backbone, good example of challenging a room full of directors 3 levels above them, successfully did it because they brought evidence, or unsuccessfully did it, failed to bring evidence, and they learned the lesson. Like, they both could be pluses from that. So I'm trying to just kind of summarize the chunks. And then when I have this chunks of what did I think of the candidate and how they answered against these different criteria, I then go look and I say, okay, 1 to 5, 5's the best, 1's the worst. How'd they think they did on strategy, think big? Or how'd they do on their product skill set? How'd they do on stakeholder engagement and collaboration and backbone? So I'll put a score in. Now, if there's one, say, on management and talent upskilling that I didn't ask any question, it's in the loop, someone's asking, but I had no opinion, I'll just leave it blank.
Right.
And so I put all these scores in. Now, these scores, the tool now will give you an average based on the ones you populated. What's the average across them? And this is just a rough indicator. It's coarse. It's not fine-grained here. But what I'm really trying to get at is, and by the way, they're unweighted. It's a very simple framework.
Yep.
And it may be somebody did 5s across the board, but they got a 1 on collaboration, and maybe they're just frankly a jerk. And they might be the most talented jerk in the world, but you've concluded they're going to tear a team apart. So you're not inclined. So you should think about the average and the color coding as indicators, but what really matters is getting to your hiring decision. And in the tool, I've got a description of my hiring framework. This came out of when I was at Amazon. There's 4 options. There is strongly inclined to hire, inclined to hire. Both of those are above the line. Not inclined to hire, strongly not inclined to hire. So there's 4 votes here. And the stronglies on each end, think of it as a normal distribution. Like, those should be rare. Maybe 5% of your votes should be strongly inclined and 5% are strongly not inclined. Because just being either side of the fence is still inclined to hire or not hire that you're going to blind vote and go into the debrief with. Now, what's important here is there is no on the fence. On the fence is a coward's vote. And I've seen that a lot over my career, where you'll have somebody who's maybe they're new to interviewing, they're just unconfident, or maybe they're a more junior person in a room, a more senior person, and they just want to follow the vote. So they'll when you do a public reveal of the vote, like, oh, I'm on the fence. And then they're looking to read the room. We don't want that. We want you to have strong opinions loosely held before you go into the debrief. So if you're on the fence, you're not inclined. It rounds down. But you have an opportunity in the debrief to hear more, to complement your wedge of the trivial pursuit pie and draw more information. And you are encouraged to change your vote if you feel this changes the overall calculus.
Yeah. So the purpose there is for you to have an immediate moment of reflection and to come to your own conclusion, completely unbiased by anybody else in the loop, and just say, this is where I place that candidate. And one thing I would add is, I've done it before where you finish an interview and immediately another meeting starts and you're on and you're off. And not taking that time to actually record your thoughts means that later on you're trying to remember, you're over remembering and you're under remembering, and you end up making a really, really bad choice. And if anything, you end up being influenced. So I would say, in terms of time management, block out 15 minutes before the interview, do the interview, and block out 15 minutes afterwards to be sure that you're ready and that you reflect.
It's also a function of how good are your notes. So
yes.
I find if you don't take any notes, you need to do it just after, or you'll lose it.
Yes,
you'll lose all the memory. I have pretty good notes, so I do it same day. I sometimes find that with an hour or two of reflection, and your brain works a lot in the subconscious to sort things out, but it still has to be same day that I'm making these notes.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move on now, if we can, to the candidate experience. We've spent a lot of time talking about the hiring managers and the process to be sure that from the company's point of view, they've got a good process and they can make a good decision. But of course, they're interviewing a candidate. What can a candidate do to be ready so that when they show up in the interviews, the 5 or 6 of them that they're going to have, that they are ready and that they perform as well as they can in each of those interviews?
So many of the topics we spoke about for the interviewer also applies to the candidate interviewee. Preparation ahead of time. So absolutely research every single person you're going to talk to. And I remember I had an interview once with a candidate, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll assume you at least looked me up on LinkedIn, so you have some background. He's like, no, I thought that would be disrespectful to like snoop. What are you talking about? This is public information. You're not using the information that's freely available to be able to have a better interview. So absolutely do your research on everyone ahead of time. Understand what is their position, how long have they been in that role, for your hiring manager, for other people. The composition of your interview, Luke, tells you something about the importance of this role. Are you meeting with a chief architect?
Yeah.
Or are you meeting with an executive member of the company? Like, that's going to help give you some important signal. But you should know everybody that you've got in the loop for sure. Do the basic research. Do the basic research on the company and the role. ChatGPT is your friend here. Just ask like, hey, for this role, for this company, what are the most important things I need to understand about the strategy of this business? And give me, 5 risks or challenges this company has to overcome to succeed. You'll have that in 30 seconds. Like, you can get some great information that also helps for questions that we'll get to that you should be asking at the end. You need to think about time management as well. And you should think of it when you're answering a question. I don't know, I try not to use sports metaphors, but basketball has this concept of a shot clock. You got to have a shot clock in your mind, and you need to make sure that you aren't just drifting. And you need to be able to make sure on a question that you aren't going so deep that you're actually burning time and you're off topic. Check for comprehension with the interviewer.
It's also soul destroying for the interviewer when that happens, doesn't it? And people talk themselves out of a job because they just ramble.
Too verbose.
Yeah.
So what will help is if you're talking more than 2 minutes without a dialogue with the interviewer on the other side, find a pause to stop and say, did that answer your question? Check for comprehension. Did that answer your question? Is a fantastic way to end every response you're giving, because then they can say, well, I was looking for something a little bit more on the strategy. Okay, now I can course correct, go further on this, and be able to internal shot clock. I've been talking for 5 minutes on this topic. Let me know if I'm going too deep. Let me know if you want me to talk on a different topic. Like, just check for directions. And that also shows you're an active listener as you're working through with the interviewer.
And you should also bear in mind that the interviewer is doing that anyway. They're sitting there thinking, he's going too deep. Yeah. He's gone off topic. He hasn't checked in with me. And they're negative points, aren't they? They sit in the interviewer's brain and you're just losing points all of the way through.
That's right. And some interviewers, they don't have the confidence to cut off a candidate mid. It's rude to stop someone
Yeah.
mid-point, but you got to recognize the seconds are precious. That's all the
Yeah.
time you've got to make a hiring decision.
Yeah. And be very aware of verbal and physical signs. Keep looking at the interviewer. Yeah. If they are, sometimes they look bored and they're trying to interrupt and you're just over talking them.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Like, listen, read the room. Absolutely. And then I'm being interviewed now for a senior role that I really, really want. And I'm going to rock up and I'm going to present a persona almost because I want you to hire me. To what degree do I do that? And to what degree do I just say, look, this is me, take me or leave me? So I'm trying to get to authenticity, but equally, I don't want somebody to undersell themselves, but also not to oversell themselves.
It's a tricky line to walk. Being authentic is valuable. It's important. It's frankly probably going to be one of the most precious things in this world of AI slop that we're already in.
Yes, yes.
Being authentic is highly valuable. You want to be honest, but you also should be optimistic. And Rick Rubin, famous producer, had recently written this great book on creativity and how to think about creativity. And I love this one phrase in an interview. He talked about, too often people are asked, like, have you ever done X? No,
Mm-hmm.
I've never done that for a job. And he has this way of phrasing it to say, I haven't done it yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yet opens opportunity. Yet is a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset of I haven't managed people or
Yep.
I haven't had a P&L. Instead, I haven't yet managed people, but I have been coaching and I've been working on interviews and you could give evidence of how you're on a trajectory or how you're capable.
Yeah. One thing I was taught, and I've tried it and it's worked, but I'd love your view on it, is pick a crazy example. Can you talk about a time when you managed a high performer? If I've never managed a high performer, you're right. If I just say, well, I've never done that, that's a close off. I could say I've never done it yet. But one thing I was trying to do is to say, I've never managed a high performer, but if I had the opportunity to do it, this is how I would approach it. Is that a good tactic?
Well, yes, it's better than just ending the question of saying, I've never hired a high performer. Maybe you look at, well, I haven't hired a high performer, but I've worked with high performers, and this is the environment I've seen that allowed them to be their best.
Got it. Yeah. And we touched on the STAR technique for interviewers, but it's also extraordinarily important for the candidate.
Absolutely. STAR technique: situation, task, action, result. In fact, your CV or your resume should also be using this. It doesn't need to be very verbose, but in a concise way, give context, because most resumes I see, they're like this encoded document of worked at a company. I may have no idea who this company is, don't even know what industry they're in. And you just say your job title, launch project ZXW.
Did this, did that.
Yeah. And you're like, I don't even know what these are. I don't know
Yeah.
if they were impactful. Did they even matter? So you really want to use this situation, task, action, result to really focus your responses.
Yeah. I've also had people say to me, and I'll use your Panama example. They say, oh yeah, I drove Project Panama. And you go, what the hell is Project Panama? It means nothing to anybody outside of the company. So it's invaluable information. Sorry, it's valueless information. And finally, I want to talk about both from the interviewer's point of view, but also from the candidate's point of view. The interviewer should leave time at the end for the candidate to ask any questions, and the candidate should ask questions. So I think from an interviewer's point of view, it's simple: have enough time, give the person the platform. What should the candidate do?
Absolutely. And this is a big part of the interviewer's role as well. I mentioned you have the intro, you've got the main body is the interviewer question, and then at the time it's the candidate's question. At least 10 minutes, at least, because you're selling as well as buying. And good candidates have other options. So sometimes I've had interviews where I've had candidates say, do you have any questions? Nope, no questions.
Mm-hmm.
That is a terrible, terrible impression. You are talking about taking a full-time role where you're going to spend more time during the week with us than with your family. and you
Hmm.
haven't got a single question about what it's like to work here, or whether or not someone's a good manager, or whether or not this business is going to be successful, like the having zero questions is a big negative. Never run out of questions. And it's easy to have a long list because you probably will only have time for 2 or 3 questions, maybe 4 max. So I find some great questions for a candidate. Some
Are there
fantastic.
areas I should avoid? For example, I shouldn't probably say how much you're going to pay me or what are the holidays like. Right? There may be some things that I should not ask about.
Um, Kind of depends. I mean, I generally I wouldn't lead with the comp. Um, because it also depends if there's a recruiter in the mix, because sometimes you
Yeah.
can use a recruiter as a candidate to ask some of those awkward questions. That's their job, to be that shuttle diplomacy between. Um, the I think first, some great questions are, okay, this role, what happened to the person who was in it before? Is it a
Oh,
new role?
interesting.
Is it was somebody in there? Oh, well, they were terminated. Why were they terminated? Performance. Why were they terminated for
Hmm.
performance? Well, they couldn't achieve their goals. Why couldn't they achieve their goals? So you're doing the same investigative journalist in
The
reverse here.
five whys. Yeah.
5 whys
Yeah.
here. Like, oh, well, they couldn't achieve their goals because it turns out they didn't have all of the team budget to hire all the roles they need, but they still failed to achieve their impact. And now you start to realize, oh my goodness. So one of my favorite questions is, how is this role set up for success? So you want
Hmm.
to understand, is it a new role? Who already existed? How is this role set up for success? Is a great question because it's very open ended. Because you may have a newly created role. Oh yeah, we created a new role. We have this new director role responsible for all this. Okay, well, someone was making those decisions before with a different title. Are they on board with this, or are you actually encroaching on somebody else's toes? Do you have budget to do this? So we want you to transform the business using generative AI. Okay, do I have any
Hmm.
budget for it? Do I
Hmm.
have buy-in from the other teams? Are my goals aligned with these other teams? So another fantastic question, one of my favorite questions for candidates to ask. Imagine I join your company in this role, whatever the title is of this role. And 12 months after I join, we are celebrating a tremendous year of impact. Tremendous.
Hmm.
What will have changed? What will
Hmm.
have changed for the customers? What will have changed for the business performance? What will have changed for our teams and organizations? What will have changed? And you suddenly will get great, crisp answers. 2, 3 things are the most important. So even though the job description listed 50 items that you're supposed to do, you suddenly have this revelation. Your performance review in the first year is based on getting these 3 things done. Get this long slogging transformation over the finish line, build a great team, bring the market something commercial can sell. Oh, okay. Now I actually have something I can work with. So
Yeah.
that actually is a really useful question. One last super valuable question for candidates to ask in the interview. Well, by the way, first I should say, be consistent in asking everyone these questions of what does success look like? Because
Right.
what you're also testing for is wildly different answers from different functional areas. So maybe, the person from finance has a totally different view of what success is, or the person from commercial, or the person from product. That's a red flag. I mean, you guys aren't aligned
Right.
of what this
Yeah.
role is supposed to do. So ask those questions. It also, asking what some of the big challenges are. What holds this business back is a great one. So before I get my last question, I should say there's a couple other useful ones you could have on your list of what does a week in the life of this role look like is a pretty good one. What's the pace of work, depending on what it is. Um, what is the maybe across the whole business, what is the biggest opportunity and challenge facing this business unit or this business or this company, which shows a little curiosity of direction outside of your particular role. So you should never run out of questions.
And
But
what I'm hearing there, by the way, Sean, is two things. Number one, as an interviewer, I'm thinking this person switched on and they want to help us be successful. I
yes,
like this candidate. I want to hire them. And secondly, from the candidate's point of view, I now know what I have to do in my first 90 days. Like I now know where I need to put my shoulder because I know what's expected of me in a year's time. I'm not
Exactly.
guessing.
And it shows curiosity. And you'd be surprised how many candidates don't show curiosity, especially if you need to assume for any job you're interviewing for, at the final round, there's going to be a slate of 4 or 5
Hmm.
amazingly qualified candidates exactly in that domain. There's just a big supply and demand shift happening here. You want to be able to stand out. And
Yep.
curiosity in the business and what helps them succeed will really cut through. Now, the
Yep.
very last question a candidate should ask, the very, very, very end, should be a very last question to each interviewer. You look them in the eye and you ask them, based on all we've discussed, do you have any reservations
Oh,
about putting me in this role?
wow.
And what you're doing, you've asked it in a very nice way.
Hmm.
You're asking them to make a hiring decision in the moment. And then you're going to see their eyes kind of like, huh, well, and they're going to, for the most times, they're going to articulate, well, I like the fact that you've had this and you've accomplished this. I'm concerned about your ability to dive deep. And that gives you an opportunity in 30 seconds. We didn't get to it, but there is this example here where we had a whole business that, was losing money. And I dug in and it turns out that, nobody ever turned off these old AWS instances and we were running hot. And by turning that off, we made the company profitable.
Hmm.
And you've had a chance to
But
mitigate.
you didn't dive off then into another half-hour spiel, did you? You
You got to be
crystallized it
super,
down to like 20 seconds. Yeah.
it's got to be super, yeah, because this is the end of your interview. Super concise on it, but you're just trying to give them evidence to help them feel you can do this.
Yeah. Amazing, Sean. Thank you so much. We've covered such a lot of material. Um, and what I'm left with is we all know that hiring is so important, and we all know that we can train from our mates because we kind of see what's going on, and we all know that we've made hiring mistakes. It's always occurred to me that if you want to find out how to do hiring really well, you go to the masters, and everybody knows that the Amazon process, I've done the loop myself, the hiring process is difficult, it's long, but it's well organized, it's well thought through. And when you get through to the end of it, you really appreciate how much you've been grilled and tested and challenged and examined. And you know that the interviewers have a really good picture of you and they can make a really good decision. So this is invaluable material. It's great material for interviewers and the panel, but also for the candidates. Because I think if you've listened to this as a candidate, you know how to gear yourself up and how to give yourself the best chance. So thank you enormously for that set of insight. But unusually here on Build Your Edge, we're doing a part 2, which we'll get to. And that's all about the debrief process. So far, we've just collected a bunch of data. We've been through a process, but now how do you make a decision? And you can download your template from buildyouredge.org/downloads. I'd like to also get from you those final questions. I'm sure we'll list those out somewhere else. So before we get to part 2, Sean, I want to thank you so much for this, and we'll see you on the next part.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.